uh, to the other channels. Alrighty. We Comrade, we can go.
Warmest revolutionary greetings, mighty daughters and sons of Africa, all over the Pan-African world. Welcome to this historic webinar with respect to violence against women and girls in the age of COVID, using culture to challenge sexual violence in Africa. This webinar is a two-part series. Part one was at the end of May and bore much profitable fruit for the Pan-African world with respect to exploring topics of culture and the relationship between culture, patriarchy, and sexual violence against women. So in this webinar, we will continue the discussion around the disturbing issue of sexual violence against women and girls in Africa and the diaspora. And we will look at this problem within the context of culture to attempt to find viable solutions. My name is Sister Thandiwe Chimurenga. I am a proud organizer for the All African People's Revolutionary Party. I have been organizing for the AAPRP for the past 32 years. The All African People's Revolutionary Party is a permanent mass Pan-African revolutionary party, which was founded in Africa, in Guinea, in 1968. Since that time, the AAPRP has spread all over the Pan-African world. We have chapters in the United States, Canada, and we are building further chapters in Africa, which is our homeland. And in particular, in Africa, we have chapters in Ghana, Guinea-Bissau, Kenya, and we continue to build. So I would like to formally welcome all of our listeners, all of our viewers to this historic webinar. Mighty daughters and sons of Africa, I want to first touch base on some information that will help to inform today's webinar. Violence against women and girls in the shadow of COVID-19 is a very disturbing and escalating trend. Activists, journalists, and the United Nations have drawn attention to a so-called shadow pandemic, an allusion to rising global levels of sexual and gender-based violence against women and girls as a result of COVID-19 and state responses to it. Reports by global media highlight the situation in Europe, but Africa is not exempt. Liberia, Nigeria, Kenya, Cote d'Ivoire, and Uganda, like China, France, and Spain, are among the countries that have reported surges in violence against women and girls since the pandemic began. Guided by the question, what don't we know about how pandemics affect sexual and gender-based violence? We wish to have a robust discussion today about the cultural tools that can be used to counteract this disturbing trend. Looking also at how organizing on a Pan-African scale can help counteract this disturbing trend. And thirdly, how education, in particular political education of women, men, and children all over the Pan-African world can help to counteract and hopefully stop this disturbing trend. Without further ado, I will introduce our distinguished first speaker. Our first speaker is Sister Titilope Ajayi. Sister Titilope is currently a PhD candidate in international affairs at the University of Ghana, where she is studying gender and activism within the Boko Haram conflict. She is a 3-time fellow of the Africa Initiatives of the Social Sciences Research Council and has specialisms in gender, conflict and security, and civil society and civic space. Over the past 15 years, Sister Titilope has conducted research on gender mainstreaming in African security forces, state responses to violence against women, African security architectures, and diverse aspects of civil society with a focus on Africa. Her current work is sponsored by the African Peacebuilding Network, Centers on Women and Terror in Africa, the intersections of national and global frameworks on women, peace and security, and the gender dynamics of the displacement crisis produced by the Boko Haram conflict. Sister Titilope has held previous appointments as the head of research and documentation at the West Africa Civil Society Institute, fellow West Africa analyst with the International Crisis Group, and research associate with the Kofi Annan International Peacekeeping Training Center, and regional program manager for West Africa with the Frederick Ebert Stiftung. Sister Titilope has consulted for the UNFPA, the European Commission, the Open Government Partnership, the African Security Sector Network, and the Women in Peace and Security Network in Africa, among others. She is an accredited member of FemWise Africa. Sister Titilope enjoys bringing academic knowledge to mixed audiences and writes periodically for Kujenga Amani, the CIHA blog, and the nonprofit Quarterly Online. In 2017, Sister Titilope founded Doing a PhD in Africa, a resource to encourage networking, peer support, and information and experience sharing among African doctoral students on the continent. Without further ado, it is our pleasure to welcome Sister Titilope Ajayi. Welcome, Sister Titilope. Sister Titilope, can you please unmute? Thank you so much.
I apologize. I didn't realize. Yeah.
Some little technical glitches.
Okay, so let me start again. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. Thank you to the organizers for inviting me to this very important conversation and one that is on a topic that is very dear to my heart. And thank you to everyone who has made time to be here on a Saturday afternoon. Just give me 1 second so that I can share my presentation. Okay, so just while I'm up getting that ready, I'm going to be talking about violence against women and girls in a time of COVID, looking specifically at the role and place of culture in relation to Africa. And I will be doing this. I have a slide that shows a screenshot of the article that Sister Mjiba was talking about earlier. But there we go. Can everybody see?
No, Sister Titilope, we cannot see.
Okay, give me 1
screen.
second, please. I apologize. I did have it open. I'm not quite sure how it disappeared.
That's okay. Just take your time and see where the issue might lie, you know.
Is it showing now?
No, it is not, Sister Titilope. Did you click on share screen?
I did. That was the first thing I did. Let me try again. Is it showing now?
Yes, I see it.
Okay. Okay.
Yes, thank you so much.
Thank you. And thank you for your patience. And apologies again for the delay. So I was saying that I will be speaking about violence against women and girls in the time of COVID and looking specifically at the role of African culture. And I will be speaking mainly to an article that I wrote that was published by Kujenga Amani in May last month. And I should just say that Kujenga is a blog of the African Peace Building Network, and it contains some really fantastic resources on diverse aspects of peace and security in Africa by Africans. And also, please note that I include a list of the sources that I use in this presentation at the end. So if anybody is interested, please contact the organizers. So I'll be speaking to three main issues. The first being that the levels of violence against women and girls that we are seeing during the COVID crisis amount to a global crisis. And I think this is important because Africa is often held up as a worst case scenario, but then it's left out of conversations about solutions. And one of the things that I will be talking about is the ways in which we can take ideas, practices, and values from African cultures and use those as a way to counter increasing levels of violence against women and girls. The second point is that culture occupies a central role in this conversation for good and ill. But as we search for new approaches inside our cultures, we need to be mindful of what needs to stay and what needs to go. So culture can be positive and it can be negative. And the third point is that putting an end to this is a collective responsibility of both genders, of different ages, of different actors at various different levels of society. And I make that point because I've done a lot of monitoring on social media of how people respond to reports of violence. And you often find men questioning, where are the feminists and where are the women's rights groups? But it's not strictly a women's issue. Women don't ask to be raped. Girls don't ask to be abused. And so it's a collective responsibility. So on this slide, by way of setting context, I've pulled some news headlines about the COVID crisis and the ways in which it's intersecting with violence against women and girls. And the first thing to note here is that you'll find that the headlines are from different countries, from different parts of the world. So you have East Africa, you have West Africa, you have Asia, there's India, there's a headline from India. And the piece about domestic abuse is a New York Times article. It was one of the earlier ones. And it talks about Europe, North America, and to some extent Asia, but it doesn't mention Africa at all. So this is widespread, it's everywhere. The second thing to note is that although we might say that this kind of violence has become more visible during this crisis, it has always been with us. So what the crisis has done is made it more visible and escalated it to a certain extent. And you see at the bottom left, the headline that says Fighting the Shadow Pandemic. That's an article by the United Nations on violence against women and children in Kenya during the crisis. And that phrase, shadow pandemic, was one that the UN developed and has put forward as a way of saying there are very high levels of violence against women and children, but because the world's attention has been so focused on fighting the health crisis, the gender violence aspect has been and still is taking place, on the blind side, if you like, of the global health crisis. And the other point I wanted to make here is that there are different types of violence. So although you find that a lot of the domestic violence makes up a significant proportion of this type of gendered violence, there's also violence by different types of actors. So in my Kujenga article, I talk about violence against women by security actors. They've been reported to abuse women who are trading, and these are petty traders, and this is their basic means of livelihood. So if you stop them from trading because there's a lockdown, then obviously you're denying them their means of survival. They've been known to beat women who are displaced, women who have had to defy lockdowns in order to go and get medication for sick children. So there's also that as well. And then I think the other point that I wanted to make was that the ways in which states have responded to the crisis is escalating the crisis in itself, because it means that either usually the regular support systems are being diverted towards a health crisis, or they've been shut down. So you find in a number of countries, in Liberia, in Nigeria, for example, the coalitions, the crisis management coalitions that were formed in many places excluded the ministries of women. Shelters, domestic violence shelters, abuse shelters, essential services like that were forced to stop operating or to go online. And that had particular implications for who had access to their services. So the responses to the crisis, in addition to the crisis, are both contributing towards escalating violence against women and girls. Now, one of the headlines says that according to the Nigeria police, it has received 717 rape cases in the last 5 months. Now, I did some very basic maths. 717 cases over 5 months breaks down to roughly 5 cases a day. Now, this is just rape cases, so it doesn't include other forms of violence against women and girls, and it also doesn't include any cases that go unreported. And we know for a fact that in many places, this kind of violence is drastically underreported because of the various obstacles that survivors face in trying to access justice. So I just did a very rough survey on social media using the accounts of newspapers, civil society organizations, activists, and blogs that I follow on Facebook specifically over the last 2 weeks. And I focused on Nigeria because I'm currently doing some research on this topic in the context of Nigeria. And I counted 52 cases. Now, out of these 52 cases, 35 were against babies, infants, girls, and teens collectively, and that 35 amounts to 67%. 21 cases, or 40%, were against teenage girls aged 13 to 19, and for 14 of those cases, or 27%, were against infants and girls aged 3 months to 12 years. Now, please bear in mind that I did this over a period of 2 weeks for roughly 1 hour every other day when I could find the time. So I invite you to imagine what these statistics would look like if I had done it for a longer period over each day consistently for the same period. So now I get into the discussion about the role and the place of culture. And when we talk about this kind of violence, there are 1,000,001 of what you would call enabling factors. In the interest of time, I can't possibly discuss them all. So what I've done is to isolate these two that I see as broad issue areas. And they're overlapping because I see them as intersecting. So on the one hand, we have crisis in the circle on the left. And I've included this as a way of showing that whenever there's any kind of social or political or economic upheaval, it predisposes all genders, but primarily women and girls, to violence, and particularly violence of a sexual nature. And the reason that this happens is that social and political structures and relations break down, and women are seen as legitimate targets of sexualized violence. And the common denominator across all these different types of crisis are negative cultural norms and practices. And I want to emphasize the negative because I'll be talking in a few minutes about how culture can also be positive. Culture is what we make it. It's not a static concept. And so just by way of example I mean, there are so many different dimensions when we talk about culture. We could talk about cultures of violence themselves, and you'll see a number of allusions in these conversations to cultures of rape or cultures of sexual violence. The other way we could talk about or think about culture is also when we talk about cultures of response. What are the ways in which state actors, the police, the government, etc., medical personnel, what are the ways in which they tend to respond to these kinds of cases? But I would really like to focus on what I would call, traditional values, norms, and practices that historically are associated with our various cultures and communities. 1 second, please. Sorry. Go and take it. I apologize. My 5-year-old doesn't understand that there are boundaries. So, yes, I was talking about, indigenous cultures. And there are a number of things. I would start by, let's talk about parenting cultures, right? And when I say African cultures, I'm not trying to say that these are necessarily peculiar to Africa. They may exist in other places, but I'm speaking on the basis of what I know and have experienced from having been born and lived here most of my life. So parenting cultures and the idea that, when you have a child, it is, because you gave birth to that child and you raised that child and you're responsible for that child, that to some extent, what you do with that child is your business. There's another side of that, which I will talk about a little bit later, which has to do with, a practice that I think we've departed from, which is the community role in raising a child, and the expression that it takes a village to raise a child. But I'll elaborate in a few minutes. The other part of it has to do with the mysticism that surrounds female and feminine sexuality in Africa. So these values that we attach to female um, virginity, and how that then feeds what you might call ritualism, and the idea that if you sleep with a virgin, you are able to use that as a way, to make money, or to, to break some kind of problem or spell in your life. There's also the general social status of women, social and cultural status of women, the fact that there's a lot of sexual objectification, the fact that women are seen as, belonging in a particular position in society. So yes, for sexual gratification, also for, unremunerated reproductive labor, and the fact that all of these then feed an attitude of entitlement by male members of society. If we talk about negative marriage practices, so, and I know this is questionable, but I want to talk about the matter of dowry, or bride price, as it's called in some places. And I don't think it's necessarily negative in itself, but the ways in which people think about it, and the kinds of attitudes that then develops, the idea that if a man pays a sum to your family, and this varies across cultures. In some places, men are asked to pay, in cows. You can pay up to 20, 30 cows or camels to marry a woman. And then this gives the man the sense that he owns you, and you are then compelled to do whatever it is that he wants, whether or not you want it, whether or not it's beneficial for you. Also, still on marriage practices, the practice of child marriage, which is very highly prevalent in the northern part of Nigeria, where I come from. And this is something that is considered to be normal and legitimized by culture, by religion, but it's very controversial, and it goes against the practice at the federal level of Nigeria, where you're not considered to be an adult or marriageable age until you get to a certain stage of your life. Also, still on marriage practices, the practice of marriage by abduction. I don't know to what extent this still prevails, but I know among the Igbo in Nigeria, at some point, it was allowed. And if you read the work of, I forget her name now, but she has a book titled The Bride Price. And in that story, you can see that there's a man who wants to marry a particular woman. She's not interested, but the culture allows him to go and kidnap her. And if he succeeds in, not raping her, that's basically what it is. But if he succeeds in doing that, then the marriage is considered to be formalized. Then, moving from marriage practices to our ideas, our norms and values about sex and sexuality, there are a number of countries where we have these coming of age rituals for males and females, where you find that the practices tend to glorify male sexuality and to encourage aggression and violence. And I know that there are secret societies in countries like South Africa, for example, where part of becoming a man is being, the numbers of women that you're able to force yourself on, basically. That's seen as confirmation of your masculinity and your manhood. And if you contrast that with the female coming of age rituals, which tend to subdue feminine and female sexuality and make it subordinate to that of a man. And that is something that I find very problematic. Also, just the cultural ideas or constructions of what is a man, what are the indicators of masculinity, and we tend to associate those with violence and aggression. And again, the reverse for females, which is humility, there are certain gender specific or gender accepted behaviors. And then the last point that I wanted to make on that was the general cultural attitude towards violence against women and girls, and this idea that it's a form of collateral damage whenever anything else is going on. And I would frequently see on social media as comments when these kinds of cases are reported that, there are so many other things that are going on in Nigeria or wherever. Why are you not reporting on that? Why are you making so much noise about violence against women and girls? Um, okay, so this is one example that illustrates some of the points that I was talking about. Now, this is a story, and I've included it was shared on Facebook from Twitter, and I've included the person's handle in case anybody wants to go and check. This was an activist who was reporting a story of a man in Oyo State in southwest Nigeria who raped his 3-year-old daughter. Now, his wife left the house with both of her children, went to a safe place, and she managed to get him arrested, but the police released him a couple of hours later. This speaks to what I was saying about the ways in which security actors respond to this kind of violence. Basically, some of them don't take it seriously. And then members of the family on her side and her husband's side started calling her, including her own mother, pressuring her to stop talking and to, protect the family dignity and saying things like every family has its problems, and trying to get her to leave the city, go to the village so that, the case would die and people would stop talking about it. So this just illustrates some of the things that I was talking about, the fact that you're not supposed to air your dirty laundry in public, the culture of secrecy that surrounds these kinds of issues, and then the normalization of violence against women and girls and the social pressure to cover up these things when they occur. So I did say that culture has two aspects. It can be positive and it can be negative. It is what we make of it. It's a dynamic thing. The culture, what we call culture today in Africa, certainly is not the same as what it was 30 years ago. Or if you go even further back, you will see that there have been drastic changes in some respects. So these are examples of positive and progressive cultures. Now, what you see on the slide are examples at what you could call a policy level or an institutional level. So on the left, you have an article about the Me Too movement in northern Nigeria, which is called Arewa Me Too. Arewa is a reference to the Hausa people and the Hausa culture and civilization. And that is significant because this is a part of Nigeria in which historically women's rights have been extremely abused, more so than in the rest of Nigeria, and where people have spoken the least about it and have confronted it the least. But that is changing now. You see on the top right a screenshot from a video, and this was a men's march organized by a civil society organization in Lagos called the Mirabel Center. And this was a protest predominantly by men in Lagos State in Nigeria. I don't know if you can see the hashtag on the banner. It says Men Against Rape. And this was a way of men getting involved in this campaign. Let me use that word. And that's important because, as I said, it's a collective responsibility. It's not the burden of the person who was abused to stop the abuser. We all have a role to play. And so this I thought was an exciting initiative. Now, the lower part of the picture, you'll see on the left an image of a cleric, I think he's a reverend father, who was one of the first people listed in the sex offenders register by Ekiti State, which is also in the southwest of Nigeria. Now, in Nigeria, there is now a federal list in addition to lists in a number of states, and I think that this is a positive thing. And then the last headline, governors declare state of emergency. This is from a meeting about 8 days ago, where all of the governors, state governors in Nigeria, sat and discussed what they considered to be a crisis of sexual violence across the country, and they came to an agreement to declare a state of emergency. Now, what this means is that they are putting laws in place, or they are adopting laws where they exist. They've made this a policy priority, so they're leading from the top, showing people that this is a serious thing, and that if you do it, you will be apprehended and you will face the consequences. Now, to go back to what I was saying about indigenous cultures and values and norms and practices, there are positive things. I think that some of them we have departed from. We need to revisit them, revisit the positives, revisit the negatives, and see how we can reactivate the positives and how we can re-engineer the negatives so that they stop enabling this kind of violence and they become a kind of solution or a progressive response to them. And again, in the interest of time, I've just highlighted one. You see that in the star at the top left, I've put Ubuntu 2.0 with a question mark. Now, the reason that I've done that is that Ubuntu is widely upheld as a Pan-African ethic of interconnectedness and, you know, how my well-being as a human being is connected to the next person. But when I looked at the people who were writing about this, I found that they were predominantly men, and their writing was being done from a gender-neutral perspective. So the reason that I put 2.0 is that if you look at the status of women and girls in many African societies and many African cultures and contexts, it's at odds with this kind of ethic that says that we're all interconnected and we're all human beings and our lives are important. So my point is that it's a good thing as an ethic, but we need to, deconstruct and we need to interrogate from a gendered perspective and see how we can make these kinds of values, these kinds of norms, gender sensitive and make them more progressive. So it's Ubuntu 2.0. In other words, a renewal, a new, updated, better, more progressive version of Ubuntu. And this is just one example. There are many, and I'm hoping that in the course of discussion, some of those things will come out. So this is my last slide, a list of sources, as I mentioned, and I will stop here and look forward to the conversations. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sister Titi Lope, for your informative and very truthful analysis of the urgent crisis with respect to sexual violence against women and girls during the COVID pandemic. I just wanted to briefly highlight some of the key points that you raised, while appreciating that everything that you shared with our audience is food for thought and also a call for urgent action. And on that particular note, you made it crystal clear that all of us collectively and individually have a responsibility to take action against this horrific issue of sexual violence against women and girls in Africa. Some of the highlights of your presentation were with respect to culture and the fact that culture as an evolving phenomenon in our society has positive and negative aspects. Culture can be defined as the total way of life of a people, including the material aspects of their lives, what they build concretely and physically, but also culture represents the immaterial aspects with respect to a people's ideas and values. And at the heart of every culture is ideology. And ideology is the set of ideas that guide and direct people in society towards predefined goals. So the core of culture is in fact the ideas and values that evolve over time. And you made it crystal clear that the ideas and values and traditions within the broader context of African culture have positive and negative aspects. So that was a critical point of your presentation, as well as the critical point of the urgent need for all of us to take collective responsibility and the fact that gender violence is not the sole responsibility of African women and girls. Our men in every facet of society, from the grassroots level right up to the government, have a responsibility to do something to eradicate this horrific practice. The other crucial point of your presentation was that these issues of sexual violence and violence against women and girls were existing prior to the COVID-19. And what has happened is that during times of social, economic, and political upheaval, it predisposes women and children and girls to violence because the structures in the society break down, or the resources, the healthcare resources, the military resources, and other resources in society are focusing on the main issue before them. And the issue of sexual violence against women and girls hangs in the shadow. And I like the way that you characterized it as a quote unquote shadow pandemic.
Mhm.
A pandemic that is existing under the sort of dominant pandemic, but is nonetheless equally important because the dignity of women and girls is being violated. You gave some very specific examples of negative cultural norms and practices that feed into the practice of sexual abuse and violence against women. And I, in the interest of time, I'm not going to go through the whole list, but you spoke about marriage by abduction, the whole issue of, this mystical idea around virginity and other examples. You also provided some very specific statistics around, in particular, Nigeria, and the disturbing incidences of rape that have been happening. You mentioned that there have been 717 rape cases over the last 5 months, and it's underreported in many cases because obviously the women and girls who are being violated are traumatized, may not know who to turn to, and unfortunately, even in those cases where they are reported, oftentimes women and girls are not being believed, and that exacerbates the trauma that they're facing. You also mentioned that culture has positive aspects, and I think one of the key points that you're making is that we must use culture, African culture, as a context for finding solutions to this pervasive problem. We must examine the underlying ideas, values, norms, and traditions within the various cultures in Africa. And these cultures vary and evolve over time. But the central point is that for the purposes of this webinar, we are examining culture as a framework, as a context for finding solutions, permanent solutions to this problem. So once again, on behalf of the All African People's Revolutionary Party, I thank Sister Titilope Ajayi for her excellent presentation, for her informative research, and for her shining example of an African woman warrior who has used her PhD and continues to use her PhD for the education and liberation of our people. I'm now going to move on to our second distinguished speaker. And it is with great pleasure that I welcome to our program Sister Nana Gyamfi. Sister Nana Gyamfi. And I will share some interesting and informative information about our sister's background. Sister Nana Gyamfi is the Executive Director of Black Alliance for Just Immigration. It is the largest Black-led social justice organization representing the nearly 10 million Black immigrants, refugees, and families living in the United States. She previously served as the board vice chair and managing director of the Black Alliance for Just Immigration. Sister Gyamfi has been a movement attorney for the past 25 years. So she shares my profession as a lawyer. So we have something in common. Nana is the current president of the National Conference of Black Lawyers and is the co-founder of Justice Warriors for Black Lives and Human Rights Advocacy. Both organizations are dedicated to fighting for human rights and Black liberation. She has served as the executive director of Black Women's Forum, an organization co-founded by Congresswoman Maxine Waters, who serves as its president. Nana is also a former professor in the Pan-African Studies Department at California State University in Los Angeles, in the United States. She has repeatedly appeared in documentaries and other media, including Tales of the Grim Sleeper and Democracy Now! With Amy Goodman. And she hosts her own weekly radio show called Conversations on the Way, the Asafo edition. It is great pleasure on my part to introduce mighty daughter of Africa, Sister Nana Gyamfi.
Thank you so very much. Thank you, Sister Thandiwe. Thank you, Sister Titi Lope, Sister Mzuri, who invited me, and the All African Women's Revolutionary Union, as well as the All African People's Revolutionary Party, for inviting us and all of you who have joined us to participate in this critical conversation. Sister Titi Lope, I want to thank you for addressing some of the key assumptions we need to look at as we consider violence against women and girls in Africa in the time of COVID. I appreciate your points about this not being an issue that's particular to Africa. We know that because of the criminalization of Black people in the Western world, that anytime we talk about violence in Black people and the continent in particular, that they try to make it as if it's an extra crispy problem in our cultures and amongst our people. And it's not. It's global. It is the result of patriarchy, which is global. And yet it is one that we must be concerned about as African women, as we look at what is happening to us and to our girls. And also talking about the different types of violence, that it's not just interpersonal violence, even though that is the most prevalent and the one that we like to discuss in our communities the least, right? It's the one that we try to hide into the corner as much as possible. And so I think that it's very important. I thank you for raising all of the different kinds of ways that we experience violence, from the physical to the emotional, the economic, child marriage, etc. And as you raised, this is all happening before COVID-19, but really comes to the front with COVID-19 because of the pandemic itself, as well as the orders that resulted from the pandemic, and especially the orders for people to shelter at home, not understanding that, or not realizing, recognizing often in the ways that the state has dealt with this, that for some people, home is not a shelter. Home is the place that they run from, right? That we are running from. And so I really appreciate all of the ways that you laid out and broke down for us what we're dealing with. And so I want to focus my commentary in the time that I have left to talk about what are some of the solutions, what are the things that are holding us back from addressing this issue, and then what are some of the ways that we might address this issue of violence against women and girls in the not just the time of COVID, but beyond the time of COVID on our beloved continent. And I think it's important to talk about this as a cultural shift that is namely shifting the culture of patriarchy, but talking about it on the micro to the macro levels. As long, there's different ways that we talk about traditionally how people can avoid, how women and girls can avoid, and I'm going to put that in quotes, being victims of violence. And in particular, I'm going to focus on interpersonal violence for a moment. And one of those, people talk about getting education. And so there's a lot of conversation about having girls be educated and the importance of the education of girls. And we know that, in fact, that is important, that there's something to be said about a culture, or when we find places where we have this culture where girls and the education of girls is not important, there's something to be said about how that reflects on the ways in which women and girls are harmed. And so that's an issue. We understand that that's one way that people can protect themselves. And yet we understand that all over the world, including on our beloved continent, that women of the so-called highest education in the Western sense of the word are still victims of violence. There's a conversation about economics and how in some parts of the continent, women have access to money. Women are the market women, are the traders, are the ones who are really making sure that the community has resources. And yet, while that is so important, economic abuse is a form of violence. And yet, at the same time, we know that having economics, having money, is not the thing that is going to solve the issue of violence against women and girls. I am Ghanaian. I was born in the United States, but like a Toyota made in Kansas, I have not given up my nationality. That is who I am. And we have a matrilineal culture, right? My grandmother, peace be unto her, before she passed, I asked her to do our family tree, to say it out. And so we could write it down. And when I looked at the tree next to the woman, there was no men. She just had no name for the men. The only men in the tree were sons. But if you were not a son, you did not show up in this family tree. And the tree went back probably, over 100 years, right? But that doesn't protect us. The fact that we have this culture, this Akan culture that focus so much on women, where the Queen Mother is the one who appoints the leader of the Asante people, that does not protect us and keep us from being victims of violence. Adopting Western culture, I think of one of my favorite songs by Fela, Lady. When I was younger, I didn't know exactly what he was talking about. As I got older, I was like, oh, he's mad at that lady wants to sit down before anybody. I thought that I was saying, yes, what's wrong with that African lady? She wants to eat a piece of meat before everybody. What a terrible woman, right? And so this adoption of Western culture, still, this ideas in terms of Western feminism, these things do not protect us. Our sacrifice in war, all over the continent, African women have taken up arms right next to the rest of their siblings, babies on their back, rifles in their arms. That has not protected us, right? And law enforcement, as has been described previously, security forces clearly have not been the solution. Neither have courts, and neither have cages that some folks refer to as jails and prisons. And so, and even the state, because in most of our continent, the state cannot really be said to be one of the people holding up the most, the ideals of our beloved leaders who had these ideals and were pressing these ideals before, in which they declared that women were important and that women should lead and that women should be centered and that our societies were nothing if our women were nothing. This is not the kind of states that we have right now on the continent of Africa. And so, again, we cannot depend on the state. We really need to look at and how do we address some of the attitudes and notions and cultural pieces, the negative cultural pieces that our sister raised, and what are the mechanisms by which we do that? And I want to posit for us two ideas with respect to some of the thinking. You know, we look all over the continent, all over the Black world, I'll say it that way, whether we're looking on the continent, whether we're looking in the Caribbean, whether we're looking at African women in Europe, or whether we're looking at African women in the United States. And we find that when we look at any uprising that is happening in the name of justice, that we are the ones leading these uprisings. When we look at who is leading the charge, who is leading these uprisings with respect to state violence against men, with respect to the violence of war, with respect to the violence against Black people, African people as a whole, you're not going to find any leadership that does not include us. And so I think, I want to challenge us to ask the question, what will it take for us as African women to take this same energy, the same intellectual capacity, the same imagination, the same use of culture to lead the uprisings, to lead the charge, to lead the movements against violence against us and against girls? What will it take for that to happen? I think of the South African women in the time of apartheid saying to the apartheid government, now you have touched the women, you have dislodged a boulder, you have struck a rock, and you will be crushed. And though I'm not saying we should crush our people, the idea, right, that we made it clear that when you touch the women, that you touch a force that is indomitable, that you touch a force that is, impenetrable, that you touch a force that can change everything. How do we tap into that energy on behalf of women and girls when we're talking about state violence, when we're talking about war violence, when we're talking about cultural violence, when we're talking about interpersonal violence? How do we tap into that energy that we know we have and that we use every day on behalf of our communities? And then once we tap that energy, what is it that we actually want to see? So we're having a lot of conversations in the United States as Black women and girls about the issue of violence, and particularly sexual violence, interpersonal violence of different forms against Black women and girls in this country. And we are looking for other solutions. In this country, I'm talking about the United States, we understand that looking at the police is not going to help us. The police are murdering us, just as they're murdering Black men in this country. We understand that the state is not going to help us. And so it's almost forcing people to have to sit down and say, within our culture, what is it that we can set up? What are the frameworks that we can use? And so we're looking at the frameworks of abolition and principles of transformative justice as ways of addressing the sexual and other forms of interpersonal violence in spaces that we live in. And I want to invite you to look at the works of our sisters like Mariam Kaba, last name Kaba, and Andrea Ritchie, and of course the seminal work by Angela Davis talking about abolition, and in particular how it relates to how we can address interpersonal violence. It requires us to have three pieces, three things that I believe, as a sister who was born here but has lived at home, goes home every year, considers myself, a continued daughter of Africa. Three pieces that we have more strongly and more easily buildable on the continent than we do in a place like the United States, where we're really in the belly of the beast and have less control over our operations. And those three pieces are shared core values, relationship, and trust. Those are the three pieces that are required for us to handle these issues of violence, of harm in our community, that can also and should also be used to handle the issue of violence against women and girls. And so, to the first issue of shared core values, this is the big cultural piece. How do we shift what we consider to be our core values culturally with respect to women? Who are women? The value of women. I'm struck by the ways in which the violence against women and girls in Africa and against Black women, African women all over the globe, I'm struck by the element of disposability that often goes along with it. So we're not just attacked, but we are attacked and then instantaneously become trash, literally dumped places, left places, treated as if we are the ones who now are devalued. We're not as good, we're not as useful, we're not as human, right? This devaluation of Black women. And it's an important piece, not just because it's devaluing over half of those who hold up the sky, but also because it's a devaluation also of anything that's perceived to be feminine. And so it's a controversial topic when we talk about what is happening with folks who are LGBTQ on the continent. But we must recognize, for those of us that care, and I'm one of those people that cares, that it's really the attack on people in that community is really an attack on perceived femininity, right? And that because there is this devaluation of womanhood and femininity, that this becomes something that becomes a danger to so many other folks of different gender identities, that and including men, because it doesn't even allow them to escape from the bars. I'm thinking of prison bars, the cages of patriarchy, and what it means for their capacity to heal and to move into this world. And so really looking at culturally, how do we shift what we see as our core values when it comes to women, when it comes to girls, when it comes to femininity, right? And really shifting, not just, oh, you're the queens of the earth, because people will queen you into oppression. They will queen you. You'll be looking fabulous in all the pictures, and yet you will have no power whatsoever, right? And so really looking at how we change the core values for real. And then the relationship aspect. What are the relationships that we can draw from culturally that protect women and girls? What are the societies? Is it the grandmother? Is it the queen mother? Who is it that we can bring to the table, that we can bring to having this conversation that is in relationship with women and girls in a way that allows that protection, and making sure that women are leading, therefore, in this work of building another way to address violence against women and girls. And then and then trust. Trust is the third piece. And the question becomes, how do we build trust when we've had so much harm that has come as a result of both Western culture and its impositions, as well as the patriarchy that lies within our own cultures? And so the way that trust is built is when people act consistently in the way that we've agreed to act. So when people are consistently acting according to our core values, when people are consistently honoring relationships that center and allow women and girls to lead, when people do that with consistency, when people are consistently self-accountable, meaning that you profess your own ways that you have harmed or enabled harm, and when the accountability system is consistent. So it doesn't depend on who you like, who you don't like, who dash you money, who don't dash you money, all of that, right? Then we're able to build the system that we want to see, and we can begin to talk about how we do these in ways that are in integrity with our cultures and the best, of course, of our cultures. We can and must take our safety into our hands. We have a saying and a hashtag that we align ourselves with in Baji that is the hashtag "We Keep Us Safe," and we have another one hashtag "We Got Us," right? And that needs to be true of African women and girls in particular, but again, as our sister pointed out, of African people of all gender identities. This is something that we all should be concerned about and that we all must work together on to make happen. I look forward to the discussion and I look forward to hearing the ideas of everyone that's assembled here on the ways forward. Thank you.
On behalf of the All African People's Revolutionary Party and all the mighty daughters and sons of Africa who are watching and listening and contemplating the solutions to this problem, I want to thank Sister Nana Gyamfi for her excellent presentation, for her grassroots insight into the problems relating to sexual violence against women on the continent and in the diaspora. Now, I am cognizant of the fact that we have mighty daughters and sons of Africa who want to ask questions and engage in the conversation, which is the purpose of the webinar. So what I'm going to do is just do a very brief summary of some of the key points that Sister Nana Gyamfi raised. Once again, my name is Sister Thandiwe Chimurenga. I'm a proud organizer with the All African People's Revolutionary Party for the past 32 years. I'm also a lawyer. Our party was founded in 1968, and we have an awesome women's wing, the All African Women's Revolutionary Union, which was founded in 1980. And in fact, the 40th anniversary of the AEWRU is coming up in November of this year. So it's quite timely for us to have this webinar on the issue of sexual violence against women and girls during the pandemic, but also because the issue of the empowerment of African women in a wider Pan-African context is an ongoing issue. And we understand within the All African People's Revolutionary Party that African women make up over 53% of the population of African people worldwide. And that when African women are properly organized within a mass Pan-African organization that has a clear ideology that comes from our culture, we've talked about culture quite a bit, then we're able to move closer to a solution. And within our organization, our objective is very clear. It is Pan-Africanism, the total liberation and unification of Africa under a just collective system, which we call scientific socialism. And because African women on the continent and in the diaspora are the foundation of African culture, they are the primary caregivers of children, they are the market women, they are the intellectuals. We understand that African women have a very important role to make the shift that Sister Nana Gyamfi raised. to do the things that Sister Titilope Ajayi raised. So without further ado, because I'm cognizant of the time ticking away, I'm just going to highlight a few of the key points that Sister Nana Gyamfe raised during her excellent presentation. She looked at the issue of sexual violence and violence against African women within the context of looking at what are the things or the practices or norms that are holding us back from addressing the issue. And she gave some examples with respect to people protecting themselves through education, but that's not enough. That's not effecting a viable solution. It helps, but it's not enough. The adoption of Western culture and feminism, it does not protect us enough. Our sacrifices in wars in Africa, that doesn't protect us enough. Our law enforcement agencies, security forces, prisons, for example, in the United States and in the Pan-African world, they don't protect us. So she talked about the need to address issues to do with negative cultural ideas. And also, she looked at how we can individually and collectively tap into the energy of resistance and solution making in order to address this issue. And she looked at three primary pieces, looking at shared core values that we have and how we can shift the values that we have that are negative to values that are transformative and conducive to the liberation of women in every aspect of life. She looked at relationships. We need to critically examine our existing relationships and build, thirdly, a culture of trust where people act based on certain agreed core values. So once again, I thank Mighty Daughter of Africa, Sister Nana Gyamfe, who is the Executive Director of Black Alliance for Just Immigration in the United States and is also a lawyer, which is a shared profession, as I am also a lawyer, so we have something in common. So given the time, and I know there are many questions and comments that are coming through WhatsApp and the chat space, I'm now going to open up for Mighty Daughters and Sons of Africa who have been watching and listening to participate in the discussion. And as our brothers and sisters come into this beautiful, empowering space, I'm going to ask our distinguished guests, Sister Nana Gyamfe and Sister Titilope Ajayi, to be prepared with pen and pencil to answer some of the questions that are coming through now. We're opening up into the Q&A aspect of this important webinar. One of the questions that has come through is how can we collectively just destroy this system, and how can we reconstruct our African culture? I'm going to list a few of the questions and then we will move to answer those. And I'm assuming that the system that this sister or brother is asking about is the capitalist system and all of its manifestations. The second question, so I will repeat that question: how can we collectively destroy this system, and how can we reconstruct our African culture? Another question is with respect to the last webinar on this topic. The attack on sex workers contradicts this demand. How do we address both? How do we address the attack on sex workers? I'm assuming this means the attack on sex workers within the context of the wider sexual violence against women and girls in the pandemic. I hope I'm capturing the essence of that question. And then I'm going to just put a third question on the table and then allow for responses from our two distinguished speakers. The question is, it's a mix of a statement and a question, by the way. It will be interesting to hear the speaker's opinion on the influence that child marriage, especially in the northern part of Nigeria, is implicated or is implicating the increase in rape. So I believe this sister or brother wants to know how child marriage is sort of fostering or increasing the incidences of rape. So I'm going to open the floor for a response, and I'm welcoming either of our sisters to feel free to respond to those questions that are now on the table. So who would like to go first?
I could go first. I don't mind going first on the first question. I think the third question I really want to leave to my sister because you are focused on that area. But I think when we're talking about destroying the system, that's a very broad question that we have been struggling with for probably at least 1,000 years at this point. But at least since capitalism reared its ugly head. And I think that I want to talk about more the strategies or like the underlying strategy. I think that we want to strike at the foundation of capitalism as much as possible. If there's a target, we want the target to be there. I think that we have so many conversations about how we can do capitalism light, capitalism, with cherry flavor, capitalism chips, where it's not so terrible capitalism, but it's some nicer kind of fuzzy capitalism. And I think that really there's an internal conversation that we have to have as individuals and collectively about what are we really concerned about? Are we mad that we're not the capitalists, right? Are we angry that we're not the ones that are in charge of that system? Or do we really want to be rid of that system? And if we come to the conclusion that we hope we do, that we really want to be rid of the system, then we're going to have to attack it at its core, which means, sort of boycott, divest, and sanction in the ways that we deal with capitalism. How are we separating? How are we distancing? How are we not supporting, right? How are we divesting ourselves from capitalism? What does that mean, in terms of our role as consumers and as people that actually like to buy stuff and like to get the benefits of capitalism? And then how do we sanction capitalism, point out the ways and the places in which capitalism harms our communities and push back against that harm? And so there's a lot of different ways that can happen, but I think what I really want to stress with people is let's be serious about attacking the foundation so that the whole house falls down, as opposed to just knocking a few bricks off or a few leaves off the top of the roof. And then with respect to I'm going to leave on that with just the first question. I'll pass it to my sister.
Sister Titilope?
Thank you. Those are interesting questions. Just a brief comment to build on what Sister Nana said, which is, the question is not a new question. We've been addressing it for a while. Basically, what I want to say is I don't know how feasible this is, because the ways in which we engage with capitalism are very highly intersectional. And so some of us are asking this question and looking at capitalism as a negative and an exploitative thing. But there are other people, as Black as you, who are benefiting from this. So, if you're looking at the power of the collective and how cohesive it is, I don't know how feasible this is. I just wanted to point that out. I'm sorry, I missed the second question. So I'll just go straight to the third one and then come back and ask for the second one to be repeated. The influence of child marriage and how it's implicating the increase in rape in northeast Nigeria. Like I said, this is a very controversial issue because Nigeria is a complicated social, cultural, and political entity. It's an amalgamation of cultures that are, in some respects, diametrically opposed to one another. And the position of Islamic culture has always been a sensitive topic. So we have a federal constitution that says you are, I think it's 18, the age of consent. And then you have a section of the population for which marriage for people as young as sometimes 10, 11. And these girls, at least when I was growing up, and I grew up in northern Nigeria, it was an accepted cultural practice for a baby to be, I'm not quite sure what word to use, but sort of betrothed in a certain sense to a man, somebody who's obviously much older. And that nurturing relationship begins at a very young age. And by the time you get to puberty, then sometimes you're married off, but it's very clear from birth that you've been assigned to a particular man. And this is something that conflicts with the Constitution, but it's still going on. And again, it comes to the issue, it speaks to the issue of how you conceptualize sexual violence. In that context, that isn't considered as rape. The culture legitimizes it, validates it. So I don't have the statistics, but I do know that in northern Nigeria, the rates of sexual violence are very high, particularly against girls and young children. So I would think that there's definitely a connection with, um, you know, the practice of child marriage and, um, the rape epidemic in Nigeria. I don't have the statistics to back it, but I imagine that it's a contributing factor. I hope that answers the question. If it doesn't, let me know and I'll come back on it. Could you please repeat the second question for me?
Yes, thank you, Sister Titilope and Sister Giamfe for your responses so far. Um, I hope I'm capturing it accurately, but the second question is with respect to the attack on sex workers,
Okay.
and how it contradicts the demand. And the way that it's worded here is, how do we address both? So how do we address the attack on sex workers?
Mhm.
Also, the whole issue of sexual violence against women and girls within the context of COVID-19 pandemic.
Okay, I was going to ask for clarification. Thank you for repeating the question. Uh, is Where were these sex workers attacked? Is this a general thing? I haven't read about it.
Yeah, this is actually a question from the last webinar. So
Okay.
I believe I wasn't present for the last webinar, but I believe there was some discussion about um, sex workers,
Mhm.
but I don't have any other information on that.
Yeah.
I wasn't participating in the last webinar, and I apologize for that. This is what it feels like the question is, and I wish if the person who asked the question was still on, they could help us with the clarification. But
Mhm.
there is in this conversation about violence against women and girls. We often hear, and I'm sure Sister Titilope has heard this as well. This idea, this notion that sex workers are as victims versus sex workers as people who have decided that this is what they want to do as work, right? And so there is a group, right, or a position within our communities that says that people who are sex workers are de facto victims of violence. It's a manifestation of the victim of violence against women and girls.
Yeah.
And then there's another group of people that are saying no, that may be true, that sometimes that is the case, but that there's also a way in which women who decide to engage in sex work are actually empowering themselves. This is how they've decided to make money, or how they've decided to get resources. And so I can see, you know, so there is this kind of contradiction in the ways that we look at it. But I think that within the context of shifting the way that we address these things, part of that shift is to hear from women, right? And to hear from girls about what is it that we see as freedom? What is it that we see as liberation? And this will inevitably be a part of the conversation, as opposed to what we're doing now, which is not really having this conversation, ashamed and embarrassed about sex workers and kind of putting them in, you know, covering them with the cloth so that no one sees them when they come into the living room. And so I think it's important that we develop again that safe space where people can have these conversations, where women can have these conversations boldly without judgment, so that we can come to some kind of agreements on these issues.
Okay, I don't have much to add to that.
Thank you, Sister Nana. I just wanted to quickly pick up on a point which Sister Titilope had raised in the context of the question about capitalism. It is true. I do agree that when we engage with our people, it's crystal clear that there are people on the continent and in the diaspora who benefit from some of the breadcrumbs of capitalism. And our great ancestors have educated us to understand that within capitalism as a system, there are different classes. And there is an ongoing class struggle happening in Africa and in the diaspora. And so within that class struggle, you have the petit bourgeois class made up of intellectuals, students, and so forth, who to some extent benefit from some of the trappings of capitalism because of their status, education, and, you know, they might get that regular paycheck. But I would caution our people to not allow these breadcrumbs from the bakery to guide our thoughts about capitalism being a viable system. It is imperative that we as a nation study the history, the over 500 years history of the capitalist system, and how it has been in the forefront of the enslavement of our people, of colonization in Africa, of what is now neocolonialism within Africa, which facilitates sexual violence against women and many of the social, political, and economic ills that we face. There are many books and documents on how the capitalist system in its various forms and phases has depleted and devastated our motherland and the diaspora. There's a book, for example, by one of our great ancestors, Walter Rodney, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. Integral to that underdevelopment is the system of capitalism and enslavement. So I would encourage our people, mighty daughters of Africa in the diaspora and on the continent, to study the history and devastation that capitalism has caused, to counter this notion that because I get my paycheck and I have my education, that capitalism is a viable system. It is not a viable system for the masses of our people. It is responsible for the enslavement, colonization, and the new forms of colonialism that are devastating not only Africa, but the African diaspora and other non-African peoples. So I will, in the interest of time, move on to the next questions. And I want to thank daughters and sons of Africa who are listening for your patience as we move through this technological webinar. There's a question that I wanted to put on the table. Someone asked, it's a statement and a question. I would like to know more about good practice in collaboration and partnership with service providers with respect to sexual sexual and gender-based violence in Africa and elsewhere. Excuse me.
Bless you.
Excuse me, thank you. Sorry, it just went off my screen. I am interested in stakeholders maximizing human and material resources. How do we avoid fragmented data and results flying in the air? And how do we better manage the sex offenders register in Nigeria? I hope I'm capturing the question. So how do we avoid fragmented data and results flying in the air? And how do we better manage the sex offenders register in Nigeria in the context of good practice and collaboration with respect to sexual and gender-based violence? My sisters.
I would ask
Okay.
you to begin, Titilope.
Okay.
The researcher, the PhD, I'll ask you to begin.
Well, thank you. This is a very valid question. I did some field work in Maiduguri in Borno State, which is the heart of where the Boko Haram insurgency began. And this was actually one of the main issues. When you have that kind of conflict, you tend to have this influx of, humanitarian actors and civil society actors and all kinds of people who come in with different motives and different resource capacities. And what I found was, on paper it sounds very nice, but in reality, people are working, there's a lot of duplication, people are working at cross purposes, different concepts, about what is going on, what constitutes violence, what is the best way to address it. And I discussed this in a paper that was published in African Security Journal in March, in early March. So it's a valid question. I think the example of Lagos State is a shining one. And there are a number of things that they've done, and I think that they're doing right. The first one is to make it a policy priority. So it comes all the way from the top, the governors, all of that political infrastructure. It has to be a priority. Then at that level, you have to put structures in place. So you have to have a designated authority who is in charge of that, and staff it with people who are trained and who are sensitive to these issues and who understand what is going on and what it takes to bring change. And then have some kind of coordinating mechanism that requires people who are working on these issues to register with that central coordinating unit. And then from that point, you can, ensure that people are working together, that they have the same objectives, that there's some kind of, centralization of the data that they collect, because numbers are a very tricky issue when you're dealing with violence against women and girls. And, you're right. Your question it hits a spot. We just don't know who is doing what in many cases, how well they are doing it, to what effect. So I hope that answers. The other thing I wanted to say was, if you're dealing with civil society organizations, you can't get away from the reality that many of them, although they may be working towards the same goals, are working in competition for the same set of scarce resources. So there is that aspect, and that has to be addressed. And one of the conversations that we're having increasingly on the continent now is, how can we leverage the wealth and the resources of African high net worth individuals and African corporate foundations, instead of relying all the time on Western funders who come in with their own motives and don't understand the context. So resourcing is also a major issue.
I just want to add to that a little bit, and thank you so very much for that information. I knew that you could handle that way better than me in terms of the specifics. But I think that we also have to recognize and that some of these solutions that we pick up, and we're really literally picking them up from the United States, Europe, etc.
Yep.
Again, those are not necessarily the solutions. There's all kind of sex offender registries in the United States. They have been used as weapons against people. because there's still discretion, right, in terms of who gets charged, who actually get, who gets believed, who doesn't get believed, all of those things. And so it's not as if you can look at that registry and actually have any absolute conclusion about either the people that are on there or what about the people that don't even make it on there, right? And so at the end of the day, we're still going to have to sit down as community, right, as Asante Newtown, as Swami, right, as these sections of our cities, our towns, etc., and decide this is how we're handling this issue. Because people who are committing sexual, acts of sexual violence in our communities, people know who these people are. It's not like they're hidden people, especially if you can make it to a registry. How are we dealing with that as community? And how do we deal with that understanding, which is a hard part for people, that harmers are often people who themselves have been harmed, that it's something beyond just them being a monster. It would be lovely if people could just be monsters and, from birth, you knew they were a hellion. They never were cute. They never smiled. They never suckled. You know what I mean? And you could just say, yeah, something from the spawn of hell and just blame them. But at the end of the day, we're going to have to figure it out. I think of the Liberian women who helped to end the war in Liberia. And one of my play aunties is one of those women. And she got elected later as a mayor of a town. And she talked about the fact that you had all of these people who were our sons, our husbands, our nephews, who had been participated in the war, who had been forced to rape their mothers, who had pillaged, and now were coming back home. And she said, look, we have to figure out, in spite of what they have done, how do we set up a system by which we recognize their humanity as well as hold them accountable and understand that there are consequences, right? And so that's the hard work that we have to do. It's much easier to kind of hope the state takes care of it or hope NGOs take care of it, as opposed to really understanding we've got to do that ourselves.
Thank you so much, Sister Titilope and Sister Nana. The last point that Sister Nana made is a very powerful segue into the next question. And I want to underscore a point that she made, that oftentimes we look for the government and NGOs and these boogie woogie people out there to solve our problems. But we need to increase our sense of accountability and agency to ourselves and our community by saying, let me start with myself. What can I do to counteract this problem, to help be part of a solution to the problem? Is there an organization that I can join that is doing work for the liberation of our people? If there is no organization in my area, in Uganda or Tanzania or Toronto or Brazil, why don't I start an organization, even if it's people? Let me start and be an active agent for change. And I think that's one of the emerging themes coming out of this webinar, is that each and every one of us has a moral obligation to get involved. And we in the AAPRP are clear that mass Pan-African revolutionary organizing is the key to the short and the long-term solution of gender violence, patriarchy, capitalist violence, and all the other ills that we face. Our people on a global scale must join or form an organization that is fighting for the liberation of our people. And we boldly encourage you to join the All African People's Revolutionary Party. We have a long history of Pan-African struggle. One of the integral aspects of our party is mass political education of our people, because in order to counteract the backward ideas and values within our culture, our people need to be re-educated. Our people need political education within the context of our organizing in order to counteract the negative ideas and all ideologies that exist. So thank you again for your comments. I'm conscious of the time. We have about 12 or 13 minutes left for the webinar. And the question that is a connector point from Sister Nana's last comment is that what are some examples of what healing looks like due to generational sexual violence, as well as current sexual violence that harms and scars our girls and women? Or what is being done to work toward healing? As this topic is so heavy, it's so personal for so many aspects being shared. So this is a very important question when we talk about sexual violence. Even talking about it is painful and personal for many of us. So I'm going to ask Sister Nana Gyamfi and Sister Titilope Ajayi to take about a minute and a half each, because we want to get in some other questions, but this question is very important with respect to healing. So I'm opening up the floor. Thank you.
So I don't know what is happening on the ground in the continent. I can speak about what's happening in the United States. And again, I really encourage people to look at the works of Mariam Kaba and Andrea Ritchie. They actually have a handbook, a workbook of how we can begin to learn how to facilitate these conversations. It's going to require setting up intentional actors, intentional participants. So people that know how to deal with trauma-induced healing and questioning, connecting folks with people that they feel comfortable with. There's a whole process that has been laid out. The workbook is a good and wonderful place to start. I don't know what's happening on the continent, but the healing has to involve the interpersonal relationships. Again, getting with folks that share the core values, that have that close relationship, and the trust issue is most important.
Thank you, Sister Nana Gyamfi. Sister Titilope Ajayi.
Well, what I've noticed over the last 3 to 4 years, is that we're seeing what you could call the resurgence of a feminist movement across Africa. But this is a movement compared to previous generations that is younger and a lot more open about this. And so what you find is, let me use Nigeria again as an example. About 2 years ago on Twitter, there was this conversation about what it means to be a woman in Nigeria. And it was started, randomly by this woman activist. And she said she was overwhelmed by the response that she got. And this led her then to start a group that is on Facebook now. It used to be called Female in Nigeria, but she got so much engagement from women all over the world that she changed it to Female in. And I'm no longer in that group, but as at the time that I was there, one of the main purposes was to stimulate conversation and get women to open up about this kind of thing. And from talking about it and trying to change the narrative at that level, then women started to mobilize on their own, within their families, within their communities, their workplaces, then to take action against incidents of violence that they either experience or witness. So there's some healing at that level. Beyond that, I can't comment further because I haven't looked closely, but I have noticed that this growing younger feminist movement is confronting these issues head on and encouraging people to speak out and to seek help.
Thank you, Sister Nana and Sister Titilope, for your insightful analysis of some of the strategies and tools that can be used for healing. I just wanted to add a few points on a personal level for brothers and sisters who might be listening and are traumatized. I think one of the important ways to either begin or continue the healing process is to engage in self-care. Number one is to acknowledge your emotions, look at your own lifestyle, and take better care of yourself on a personal level with respect to your nutrition, your sleeping habits, the people who you engage with on a daily basis. All of these elements that you have some control over, I would ask you to sort of use your power in that sense to consciously engage in a self-care program where you learn to love yourself and respect yourself. Because that, in my mind, is the foundation for healing. The second point I wanted to make is that if you have even one person you can confide in to talk about what you're going through, to share your emotions, who you trust. As Sister Nana said, our relationships must be based on trust. I have found that for certain issues that I've gone through with respect to divorce, for example, having at least one person I can talk to is a tremendous source of healing. And then thirdly, on a spiritual level and a religious level, if you are a person of faith, and you have a group that you can turn to based on your spirituality or your religious conviction, that can also be another source of healing. And we wish you all the best on your journey because the trauma in our community is multidimensional and it's intergenerational. So we wish you all the best on your healing journey. Now, in terms of other questions, there are fantastic questions. I'm going to put two questions on the floor, recognizing that I think we have about 7 or 8 minutes left for the webinar. Number one, is there an active coalition that is working to weaponize the masses to get involved in this issue of violence against women and girls in the shadow of COVID-19? So the question is there an active coalition or organization that is working to weaponize the masses to get involved? The second point, I'm just going to put this on the table, is the issue of Ubuntu, which Sister Titi Lope had raised in her presentation. This particular sister or brother is interested in exploring solutions from the Ubuntu angle and is looking for guidance on that point. So I'll pause there. And again, because of time, I would ask our beautiful sisters to take about a minute each to respond so we can get in some more questions. Thank you.
Sister Titi Lope, you want to start?
I was going to ask you to start.
Oh, that's fine. I can do it. It's not a problem. So looking at the issue of or coalition, again, I'm not sure of different coalitions that are specifically looking at this issue. I know that there's a group called Africa Rising that is looking at many of the issues that are of concern with respect to our liberation on the continent. And I would encourage people to connect up. It's a women-led organization. And I would encourage folks to look at Africa Rising. You can find them on Twitter and on Instagram and on Facebook. And so that's one place which you can begin. And I'm trying to remember the second question, but I'll pass it to you, Titi Lope, in terms of the coalition part, and then come back for the second question.
Oh, the second question was about Ubuntu.
Okay, perfect.
Yes,
so let
and
me
wanting
pass it
more
to
information about Ubuntu. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, let me start from the back. Those are both great questions. I'm not a specialist on Ubuntu. It's just something that intrigues me. I know that it seems to be more active in Southern and Eastern Africa. It's something that I read about when I was looking at, cultural responses, not just to violence against women, but to some of the other challenges that we have. And I found this interesting paper by a Zimbabwean woman, and it's in the sources that I use. I think it's called Oppressive and Liberative. And she's looking at two sides of an ethic like Ubuntu, which we normally idealize. But she's saying that if you look at it from the perspective of a womanist, you start to see that it's not as rosy as it's often presented. And so she's saying it's a good thing in essence, but that we need to break it down and look more closely at how it serves and or disserves different groups of people, depending on where you're positioned in society. And the first part of the question was about coalitions. I don't know at a global level. I know about Africa Rising, and I think it's a good example of people pulling together from across the continent and the diaspora, working against some of the major challenges that we face as Black people and people of African descent. But within countries, you will usually find fairly robust civil society structures that are working against these issues. So if you're looking for a way to contribute, that's a good place to start. I know that these structures are stronger in some places and weaker in others. So it's also another way that you can contribute by helping maybe to raise the level of awareness or to enhance capacity levels, or even contribute money or volunteer, just to help in some way, because there are severe resource constraints. But within countries, there are very strong civil society structures. Usually, at a global level, I don't know, but I will check.
Thank you, Sister Titi Lope and Sister Nana Gyamfi. We're actually moving towards winding up this very informative webinar on sexual violence against women and girls in the age of COVID, using culture to challenge sexual violence in Africa. We have time for just one more question, but I do want to share some of the comments that Mighty Daughters and Sons of Africa who are watching and listening are sharing. They are very empowering. Discussion on hot topics will be a spark for the audience. Men have a responsibility. Women's collaboration is a form of silence, or women's okay, I think what this brother or sister is saying is that men have a responsibility to do something about the sexual violence, and where women are silent, it's a form of collaboration in the violence. Another comment is, one moment, please. We need to work together to stop this, change this, and make the situation better. We need systemic change premised upon education as well as judicial measures. Women must be supported, not dominated by men in their empowerment. So the whole issue of power is an integral part of the discussion on sexual violence within a patriarchal capitalist system, which emphasizes male domination, economic and political power. So the issue of power, as we see it, is one of the underlying themes when we look at why men commit acts of sexual violence against women. Okay, so just one more question, and then we need to wrap up. The question is, I would like to know how, as Africans, collectively across gender, we can put on the table the project of reprogramming ways of seeing, being, and feeling as they relate to both men and women in the context of an empowered human in Africa. So I'll just repeat it very quickly. I would like to know how, as Africans, collectively across gender, we can put on the table a project of reprogramming the way we see, be, and feel in relation to both men and women in the context of empowered humans in Africa. So Sister Titi Lope, I'll start with you. And you have about 45 seconds to a minute.
Well, we had this process in Nigeria a few years ago. I stopped following because it became too controversial. But it was sort of a national reflection, if you like, on where we had come from as a people and where we were looking to go. So listening to that question, to me, this is what comes to mind, that we need to do some kind of collective reflection, soul searching. And we are not without guidance. If we look at the early, independence and freedom fighters, there's a lot of very good knowledge and sort of plans about visions for Africa. I think if we could go back to some of those readings and just think about what they mean for us today, and the paths that we've traveled since, historically as a people, and where we want to go and what it will take for us individually and as societies and communities. There's still a lot of division within Africa. All of that needs to be addressed, even within specific countries. So collective reflection, setting of values and principles, and then some kind of an action plan. Where is it that we want to go? How is it that we think is the best way to get there?
So I would only,
Lope?
sorry, I apologize. I
That's
would
okay.
only add to that I think we need to do that in pods, like as small collectives that then become the larger national conversation. But I think that because sometimes it's hard on a national level, it really ends up being pods. It's just pods that have come together in this one space, right? And so I think it's important, like literally block by block, if you live where there are blocks, right? Hamlet by Hamlet, yard by yard, depending on where you are, that we sit down and we do that reflection and we do it to ourselves, but that we also do it out loud with each other in those groups. And so even in our family units, our friend units, are we having these conversations? Are we having these reflections, again, in a space that is safe, so that when someone starts talking, someone's like, no, we're not starting to attack each other, but really looking and seeing how can we, in our closest of circles, have these conversations and then begin to expand the circles from there so that it does become a national conversation naturally, right? As a result of the collective work that we've done in our smaller spaces.
Asante Sana Medasipa, Sister Nana Gyamfi and Sister Titilope Ajayi, for your outstanding contribution to this webinar on violence against women and girls in the age of COVID-19, using culture to challenge sexual violence in Africa. On behalf of the All African People's Revolutionary Party, we thank you so much, our distinguished mighty daughters of Africa, for the preparation you did, for your contribution, and for your shining example as beacons of hope within the Pan-African struggle for the total liberation of Africa. And that liberation struggle must include the total emancipation of African women from all forms of oppression, violence, and patriarchy. So thank you so much for taking time to participate in this historic webinar. On behalf of the All African People's Revolutionary Party, I, Sister Thandiwe Chimurenga, thank all of you, brothers and sisters, mighty daughters and sons of Africa, for participating in this webinar, for your questions, for your concern, for your activism, and your revolutionary love for African people around the world. My name is Sister Thandiwe Chimurenga. I am a proud organizer for the All African People's Revolutionary Party. I am a lawyer and I am a mother to two beautiful teenage sons. And I have a deep and abiding concern for the situation with respect to violence against women in our communities worldwide. I also want to point out that the All African People's Revolutionary Party is a mass Pan-African revolutionary party that is based in Africa. The objective of the party is Pan-Africanism, the total liberation and unification of Africa under scientific socialism, because until Africa is free, no African anywhere will be free. So we encourage you to join the All African People's Revolutionary Party. You can go online to obtain more information. The website address is www.aap-intl.org, or you can just put the name in and our website information will pop up. We will be having a series of webinars to commemorate Pan-African Women's Day on or around August the 9th of this year. So stay tuned for that, brothers and sisters. I want to thank Sister Mjiba Pratiwat, one of our great and mighty Daughters of Africa organizing in Ghana, the Ghana chapter of the AAPRP, for the exceptional work she has done to facilitate this webinar, and Brother Jassy, who is behind the scenes, dealing with the technical and technological aspects of the webinar. And I want to thank all of the struggling sisters and brothers in the AAPRP and all the Pan-African organizations on the continent of Africa for the outstanding work that you're doing to organize against sexual violence and other forms of oppression that affect African women and girls prior to the pandemic and currently. Thank you so much. Be safe, love yourself, respect yourself, study the proud history of our people. We are the original people of the planet, and we are rising and shining. And you all have an important role to play in the liberation of our people. We love you, we respect you. Forward to one unified socialist Africa. Thank you so much.
Forward ever.
Backward
Forever.
never. Forward ever.
Yes.
Backward.
never.
Backward never. Thank you so much. Appreciate you all. Thank you.
Thank you so
Thank you
much.
very
Thank
much.
you,
It was an
Sister
honor
Titi.
to
Thank
be
you,
here.
Nana.
Thank you.
Sister Taniway, wait small.
Pardon?
She's speaking Ghanaian English.
Sorry. Sorry. Wait a moment.
My pleasure.
It's difficult to go